It all started when my brother Paul announced his engagement to his girlfriend, Sandra. At first, I was thrilled. Paul had always been a kind soul, and though our childhood had been filled with both joy and hardship, he had emerged from it stronger than anyone I knew. Sandra seemed charming, polite, and well put together. I remember her first family dinner like it was yesterday. She smiled at my parents, listened intently to our stories, and even offered to help clean up afterwards. I thought she was perfect for Paul. Little did I know that her charm was only skin deep. Growing up, our family had a modest life, but there was one item that we considered invaluable: a delicate ruby necklace that had belonged to my great-grandmother. It had passed from one generation to the next, always going to the eldest daughter, and eventually it came to me. My mother had entrusted it to me when I was 22, right before I moved out of our family home. She told me, "This necklace represents the strength of the women in our family. Keep it safe, and when the time comes, pass it down." The weight of that responsibility was something I carried proudly. I never wore the necklace often, only for special occasions, but each time I did, I felt an indescribable connection to my family's history. My great-grandmother had fled her war-torn country with nothing but that necklace. It had been my grandmother's comfort during the years she spent raising her children on her own, and it had been my mother's most prized possession as she navigated raising Paul and me after my father's sudden passing. It was more than just jewelry. It was a symbol of resilience. It wasn't until Paul and Sandra's wedding day that I began to notice something was off. Sandra had asked me if she could borrow the necklace. She said she wanted to wear something with meaning and promised she would take good care of it. I hesitated, but Paul was getting married. It was a big day for all of us. I told myself it would be fine. Reluctantly, I agreed, though a part of me felt uneasy as I handed over the delicate box. Sandra beamed as she took it, almost like a child receiving a new toy. She promised she would return it the next day. But the next day came and went, and Sandra didn't mention the necklace. Days turned into weeks, and then months. The next time I asked her about it, she gave me a strangely vague answer. "Oh, I have it somewhere, don't worry, I'll get it back to you." I tried to brush it off, but my gut kept telling me something was wrong. I brought it up to Paul once. He gave me an awkward laugh, patted my shoulder, and said, "You know how Sandra is with jewelry. She probably misplaced it, but I'm sure it'll turn up." His tone dismissed my concern as if I was overreacting. I let it slide. After all, they were newlyweds. They had other things on their minds. But a year passed, and Sandra still hadn't returned the necklace. By then, she and Paul had bought a new house, and they were settling into their lives together. Whenever I brought up the heirloom, Sandra seemed to find a way to dodge the conversation. She'd change the subject, pretend she didn't hear me, or give me some vague promise that she'd look for it. Eventually, she stopped responding at all. It felt like she was trying to make me forget about it. I knew I couldn't let that happen. One night, after an awkward family dinner where Sandra completely ignored my polite requests about the necklace, I decided I needed to take matters into my own hands. My mother had asked me about it recently, her voice tinged with sadness. "That necklace is important, Emily," she'd said softly, and I could hear the worry behind her words. She trusted me with it, and I couldn't let her down. So, I started to do a little digging. I noticed that Sandra had become increasingly active on social media. She had a perfectly curated Instagram, showcasing every aspect of her seemingly glamorous life: new clothes, fancy dinners, weekend getaways. And then, one day, as I scrolled through her photos, my heart stopped. There it was, my great-grandmother's necklace. Sandra was wearing it, posing in front of an expensive restaurant. The caption read, "Feeling fabulous with this vintage beauty. #heirlooms #classic charm." I felt a mix of emotions: rage, disbelief, sadness. She had lied to me, and now she was flaunting it for likes. I knew confronting her directly wouldn't work. She'd just make excuses or pretend I was making a scene. Instead, I decided to play the long game. If Sandra wanted to treat my family's history like some kind of accessory, I'd make sure she'd regret it. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Paul and Sandra were hosting a housewarming party at their new place, and they had invited all their friends and family. I arrived early, carrying a bottle of wine and a smile that concealed my true intentions. I knew their house had security cameras, so I had to be smart about this. I needed access to Sandra's jewelry collection, and I had a plan. As guests started to arrive, I watched Sandra flit around, greeting everyone, showing off her newly decorated living room. I chatted with Paul for a while, waiting for the right moment. Eventually, Sandra made her way over to me, a fake smile plastered on her face. "Emily, I'm so glad you made it," she said, leaning in to give me a quick hug. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," I replied, matching her enthusiasm. I glanced around, then added, "Hey, I've got a little housewarming gift for you two, but it's in the car. Mind if I grab it real quick?" Sandra blinked, momentarily confused, then waved her hand. "Oh, sure, go ahead." I slipped out of the living room and made my way down the hallway. I remembered the layout of the house from their previous tours. The master bedroom was upstairs, and I knew that was where Sandra kept her things. I walked quickly but quietly, making sure no one noticed me slipping away. The party noise downstairs grew fainter as I reached their bedroom door. Once inside, I began to search, carefully, methodically. I opened drawers, scanned shelves, until I found it, a small, ornate jewelry box on her dresser. My heart raced as I lifted the lid. Inside, amidst her other trinkets, lay my great-grandmother's necklace. Seeing it again filled me with a strange mix of relief and anger. It was time to end this. But I wasn't just going to take the necklace back. That would have been too simple. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took several clear photos of the necklace in Sandra's jewelry box, making sure to capture the details. I then carefully closed the lid and placed everything back exactly as it had been. I returned downstairs with the housewarming gift that was never really in my car, and Sandra didn't seem to suspect a thing. I stayed for the rest of the party, chatting politely, smiling, even laughing when appropriate. But inside, I was formulating my next move. The next day, I went to the police. I knew it was a risk, but I also knew I had proof. I told them about the family heirloom, about Sandra borrowing it and refusing to return it. I showed them the photos of her wearing it on social media, and I provided the pictures I had taken in her jewelry box. It was enough to file a report. The officer told me they would look into it, and I left the station feeling a mix of anxiety and determination. I wasn't backing down. A week later, I got a call from Paul. He sounded frantic. "Emily, what the hell did you do? The police showed up at our house today. Sandra is furious." I took a deep breath. I did what I had to do, Paul. That necklace belongs to our family, and Sandra refused to give it back. I asked her so many times, and she kept lying to me. Paul was silent for a moment, then sighed. "You could have just talked to me." "I did," I replied, my voice trembling. "You didn't take me seriously. You let her treat something precious to our family like a costume piece." There was another long silence. Finally, Paul said, "I'll make sure you get it back. Just drop the charges, okay? Sandra's already talking about getting lawyers involved." I agreed to drop the charges on one condition, that Sandra return the necklace personally and apologize to my mother. Paul hesitated, but eventually agreed. 2 days later, Sandra showed up at my apartment, her expression cold and resentful. She handed me the necklace without a word, her eyes filled with disdain. I didn't care. I had what mattered, but I wasn't done yet. I knew Sandra valued her image more than anything, so I made sure that her friends and acquaintances, those same people who had liked and commented on her Instagram posts, knew the truth. I didn't make a public post. I wasn't that cruel. Instead, I sent a carefully worded message to a few key people, mutual friends who had been at the wedding, who had seen Sandra wearing the necklace. I explained simply and honestly that the necklace had been a family heirloom and that Sandra had refused to return it until legal action was threatened. The fallout was quiet but unmistakable. Sandra's social circle began to distance themselves. Her once carefully curated Instagram feed grew less and less active. She stopped showing up to family events, and when she did, she was noticeably subdued. Paul stayed with her, but even he seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn. I didn't enjoy causing my brother pain, but I knew I had done what was necessary. Months later, my mother held the necklace in her hands, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you, Emily," she whispered. "You did the right thing." It wasn't the victory I had wanted. I never wanted this kind of drama, this kind of hurt, but it was the victory I needed. Sandra might have thought she could steal a piece of my family's history without consequence, but she learned the hard way that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And as for me, I learned that protecting what matters isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. The necklace, with its delicate ruby glinting in the light, was back where it belonged, and I knew I would never let anyone take it from us again. Months passed, and life settled back into a semblance of normality. The holidays came and went, and for the most part, our family moved on. Paul continued to be distant, though. He still loved Sandra, and though I didn't fully understand why, I knew it was his choice to make. My mother and I tried to keep things cordial whenever Sandra was around, but the air between us was always tense, a layer of resentment hanging over everything. It wasn't until one spring afternoon that things took an unexpected turn. I was in my apartment, sorting through old boxes in the closet, when I received a text message from an unknown number. It simply said, "You need to come to the house. It's about Sandra." My stomach tightened. I couldn't tell if it was Paul or someone else, but the message seemed urgent. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my coat and headed to Paul and Sandra's house. As I pulled up, I noticed Paul standing outside, his face pale and drawn. He waved me over, his expression somewhere between exhaustion and frustration. "Paul, what's going on?" I asked, stepping out of my car. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It's Sandra. She's been acting off. She keeps talking about the necklace, saying she can still feel its weight. She's convinced it's cursed or something. She's losing sleep. She's jumpy all the time. I don't know what to do." I frowned, unsure how to respond. "Paul, the necklace isn't cursed. It's just a piece of our family's history. Maybe Sandra's feeling guilty." Paul looked at me, his eyes filled with something like desperation. "Please, just talk to her. Maybe she needs to hear it from you. I think she's scared." Reluctantly, I agreed. He led me inside, and I could hear Sandra's voice from the living room, muttering, almost whispering. As I stepped into the room, I saw her sitting on the couch, her eyes wide and glassy. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "Sandra," I said gently, approaching her. She looked up, her gaze locking onto mine. For a moment, I saw pure fear in her eyes. "Emily," she said, her voice trembling, "it's the necklace. I know it sounds crazy, but I can feel it. It's haunting me. I keep having these nightmares. I see your great-grandmother. I see her running, and I can't escape it." I hesitated, then sat down across from her. "Sandra, it's not the necklace. It's your guilt. You know what you did was wrong, and you're having a hard time accepting it. The necklace is just a symbol. You need to let go of whatever you're holding on to." Tears welled in her eyes, and she wiped at them furiously. "I never meant for it to get this bad. I wanted to be part of the family. I thought if I wore it, I'd belong. I didn't realize how much it meant to you." I took a deep breath, trying to find some compassion. "Sandra, the necklace represents the strength of the women in my family. It's not something you can take and wear just to feel like you belong. You belong because Paul loves you, because you're part of his life. But you need to respect our history." Sandra nodded, her shoulders sagging as she finally let the tears fall. Paul stepped into the room, watching us silently. I looked over at him, and he gave me a small, grateful nod. I knew this conversation wouldn't fix everything. There was too much hurt, too much mistrust, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Sandra began to change. She reached out to my mother, apologizing sincerely for what she had done. It was awkward, and my mother was wary, but eventually she accepted Sandra's apology. I, too, found myself softening. I would never forget what Sandra had done, but I could see she was trying to make amends, and maybe that was enough. Paul and I began to rebuild our relationship, slowly but surely. We had always been close, and I missed having my brother in my life. It took time, but we found our way back to each other. We never talked much about the necklace, or the police, or the party. Instead, we focused on what mattered: our family, our history, and the strength we drew from one another. And as for the necklace, it remained safely locked away, only brought out for the most special of occasions. It was a reminder of what had been lost and what had been regained. It was a symbol of resilience, not just for the women who had come before me, but for me, for Paul, for our family as a whole. Sandra would never wear it again, and she knew that. But she found other ways to connect with our family. ways that didn't involve stealing or deception. And in time, she became part of our story too, not because of the necklace she'd taken, but because of the trust she had worked so hard to rebuild. Life moved on, as it always does. There were more family gatherings, more dinners, more memories made. And while the sting of betrayal never fully disappeared, it was softened by the understanding that people can change, that even the most fragile bonds can be mended if given enough care. The necklace now sat in my mother's safe, waiting for the next generation, a new chapter in its long, storied journey. And as I looked towards the future, I knew one thing for certain. I would protect what mattered always, but I would also leave room for forgiveness, for growth, and for love. Because in the end, those were the true heirlooms worth passing down.